The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty streets of Fallujah as Marine Lance Corporal Sarah Martinez adjusted her Kevlar helmet and checked her rifle one final time. The air was thick with tension and the acrid smell of burning fuel from a nearby checkpoint that had been hit the night before. She had been deployed to Iraq for 8 months now, serving as a communications specialist with the 1st Marine Division during the height of the insurgency in 2004. Sarah never imagined she would be in this position when she enlisted 2 years earlier. Growing up in a small town in Texas, she had joined the Marines to pay for college and see the world beyond the cotton fields and oil rigs that dominated her hometown landscape. Her father, a Vietnam veteran, had mixed feelings about her decision but ultimately supported her choice to serve. Her mother worried constantly, calling the recruiter's office multiple times to ask about safety protocols and training procedures. The mission briefing that morning was routine: escort a convoy of supply trucks through the city to deliver medical supplies and food to a forward operating base on the eastern edge of Fallujah. Intelligence reports suggested minimal insurgent activity along the planned route, though everyone knew that could change in an instant. The city had become a maze of improvised explosive devices, sniper nests, and ambush points where insurgents could strike without warning and disappear into the labyrinth of narrow alleyways and abandoned buildings. Sarah's squad consisted of 12 Marines, including Sergeant Rodriguez, a seasoned veteran from Los Angeles who had already completed 1 tour in Afghanistan. There was also Corporal Thompson from Ohio, who kept everyone's spirits up with his endless supply of jokes and stories from back home. Private First Class Johnson, barely 19 years old, carried the squad's automatic weapon and tried to hide his nervousness behind a facade of bravado that fooled no one. As they loaded into their armored Humvees, Sarah thought about the letter she had written to her younger sister the night before but hadn't yet sent. In it, she described the strange beauty of Iraqi sunsets, the kindness of local children who would wave at their convoys, and the strong bonds she had formed with her fellow Marines. She also wrote about her fears, not just of dying, but of losing herself in the violence and chaos that surrounded them daily. The convoy began moving through the city streets at exactly 0800 hours. Sarah sat in the passenger seat of the 3rd vehicle, her radio crackling with routine check-ins from other units operating in the area. The streets were unusually quiet, with few civilians visible and most shops closed despite the early hour. This should have been their first warning sign. But in a city where normalcy was already a distant memory, the absence of activity didn't immediately raise alarms. They had traveled approximately 2 miles into their route when the first shots rang out. The distinctive crack of AK-47 rifles echoed off the concrete walls of surrounding buildings as insurgents opened fire from multiple positions. Sarah immediately began coordinating with headquarters, calling for backup and reporting their position, while Sergeant Rodriguez shouted orders to his team. The ambush was well planned and expertly executed. Insurgents had positioned themselves in buildings on both sides of the street, creating a deadly crossfire that made it nearly impossible for the Marines to find adequate cover. The lead vehicle's driver was hit in the first volley of shots, causing him to lose control and crash into a concrete barrier. The second Humvee managed to reverse direction, but became stuck when its rear wheels dropped into a crater left by a previous IED explosion. Sarah's vehicle was caught in the middle of the kill zone. As bullets shattered the windshield and punched holes through the armored doors, she continued transmitting their coordinates and casualty reports while her teammates returned fire. The radio in her hands became her lifeline to the outside world, the only way to ensure that someone knew their location and could send help. Private Johnson was the first in their vehicle to be hit, taking a round through his shoulder that spun him around and knocked him to the floor of the Humvee. Sarah immediately began applying pressure to his wound while still maintaining radio contact. The metallic taste of fear filled her mouth as she realized how quickly their routine mission had turned into a fight for survival. Sergeant Rodriguez made the difficult decision to abandon their disabled vehicles and seek cover in a partially destroyed building about 50 meters away. One by one, the Marines began moving across the exposed street, while their teammates provided covering fire. Sarah helped carry the wounded Johnson, her radio still clutched in one hand as she stumbled across the debris-strewn asphalt. They managed to reach the building just as insurgent fighters began moving to flank their position. The structure had been damaged in previous fighting, with large holes blown through its walls and most of its windows missing. But it provided better protection than the street. And from its second floor, they could see the positions of some of their attackers. For the next 3 hours, Sarah and her squad held their ground against overwhelming odds. She coordinated air support requests, medical evacuation procedures, and tactical information, while her teammates fought desperately to keep insurgent forces from overrunning their position. Her radio became increasingly damaged as bullets struck the building around them, but she managed to maintain intermittent contact with headquarters. The situation grew more desperate as their ammunition began to run low and 2 more Marines were wounded by sniper fire from a nearby mosque. Sarah found herself not just handling communications, but also providing medical aid, distributing ammunition, and even returning fire when insurgents attempted to storm their building. As the afternoon wore on, it became clear that their position was becoming untenable. Intelligence reports indicated that insurgent reinforcements were moving toward their location, while the promised Marine relief force was still at least an hour away. Sergeant Rodriguez began planning their withdrawal to a more defensible position several blocks away, knowing that moving in broad daylight would be extremely dangerous. It was during this movement that everything went wrong. As Sarah emerged from the building to help evacuate the wounded, insurgent fighters who had managed to get within close range opened fire with automatic weapons. The first bullet struck her in the legs, causing her to stumble and fall. As she tried to crawl toward cover, more rounds found their target. The world seemed to slow down as Sarah felt the impact of multiple bullets tearing through her body. Pain exploded through her chest, abdomen, and arms as she collapsed onto the rubble-strewn ground. Through the haze of shock and agony, she could hear Sergeant Rodriguez screaming her name and the desperate voices of her teammates calling for a medic. Blood began pooling beneath her as she lay motionless in the street. Her radio, still functioning despite the damage, crackled with frantic calls from headquarters requesting status updates. But Sarah could no longer respond. Her world had narrowed to the immediate struggle to keep breathing as her punctured lungs fought for air. The firefight continued around her fallen body as her squad members risked their own lives attempting to reach her. Corporal Thompson made 2 unsuccessful attempts to cross the street under heavy fire before being forced back by the intensity of insurgent gunfire. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours as Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness, her life slowly ebbing away onto the dusty Iraqi street. When Marine reinforcements finally arrived and secured the area, they found Sarah barely clinging to life. The medics who examined her were amazed that she had survived at all. 11 bullets had found their mark, causing massive internal damage and blood loss. As they worked frantically to stabilize her for evacuation, none of them expected her to survive the helicopter ride to the nearest field hospital. But Sarah Martinez was tougher than anyone imagined, including herself. As the medical helicopter lifted off from the landing zone, carrying her broken body toward what everyone assumed would be her final destination, something deep inside her refused to surrender. Perhaps it was thoughts of her family back in Texas, or the bonds she had formed with her fellow Marines, or simply an innate stubbornness that had carried her through Marine Corps boot camp and 8 months of combat deployment. Whatever the source of her determination, it would need to sustain her through the darkest hours that lay ahead. The doctors at the field hospital would later describe her condition as the worst they had ever seen in a patient who remained alive. But Sarah Martinez was just beginning her fight, a battle that would test not only her physical endurance but also her mental strength and will to survive against impossible odds. The field hospital's emergency bay erupted into controlled chaos as the helicopter carrying Sarah Martinez touched down on the landing pad. Medical personnel who had seen countless wounded warriors stream through their doors took one look at her condition and immediately understood they were facing something extraordinary. Dr. Patricia Hayes, a trauma surgeon from Chicago who had volunteered for deployment, later described Sarah's arrival as the moment that tested everything she thought she knew about human endurance. Sarah's vital signs were barely detectable when they wheeled her into the operating theater. Her blood pressure had dropped to dangerous levels, her pulse was weak and irregular, and she had lost an estimated 60% of her blood volume. The 11 bullet wounds had caused massive internal damage. Her liver was lacerated, One lung had collapsed. Her small intestine was perforated in multiple places, and her left kidney was barely functioning. Dr. Hayes and her surgical team worked for 14 straight hours in their first attempt to stabilize Sarah's condition. They removed bullet fragments from her chest cavity, repaired damaged organs, and transfused unit after unit of blood to replace what she had lost on the streets of Fallujah. Twice during the surgery, Sarah's heart stopped beating, and only aggressive resuscitation efforts brought her back from the edge of death. When the surgery finally ended in the early morning hours, Dr. Hayes was exhausted but cautiously optimistic that they had addressed the most immediate threats to Sarah's life. However, she knew that surviving the initial trauma was only the beginning of what would likely be a very long and uncertain recovery process. The extent of Sarah's injuries meant that even if she lived, she would face months of additional surgeries and rehabilitation. Sarah remained unconscious for the next 36 hours, her body fighting battles on multiple fronts as infection threatened her surgical sites and her damaged organs struggled to function. Nurses monitored her around the clock, adjusting medications and checking for signs of improvement or deterioration. Her fellow Marines who had been wounded in the same ambush visited when they could, sitting quietly beside her bed and talking about home, sharing memories of their time together, and promising to write to her family. During her second night in the hospital, Sarah began showing signs of consciousness. She would occasionally open her eyes and seem to focus on faces around her bed, though she remained unable to speak due to the ventilator that was helping her breathe. Dr. Hayes was encouraged by these small signs of neurological function, as brain injury from blood loss had been one of her major concerns. It was during this period that Sarah's family received word of her injuries. The notification team that arrived at her parents' house in Texas delivered the news that every military family dreads. Their daughter had been critically wounded in action, and her survival was uncertain. Her father, drawing on his own military experience, maintained outward composure while making arrangements to travel to Germany, where Sarah would be transferred for more advanced medical care. Her mother broke down completely, unable to process the possibility that her daughter might not come home. Meanwhile, in Iraq, the insurgent attack that had nearly killed Sarah had prompted a massive response from coalition forces. Intelligence analysts were working to identify the fighters responsible, while combat units conducted sweeps through the neighborhoods where the ambush had occurred. The attack had been particularly brutal even by Fallujah standards, and military commanders were determined to send a message that such actions would not go unpunished. Sergeant Rodriguez, who had managed to survive the firefight with minor injuries, spent hours being debriefed by intelligence officers about the circumstances of the attack. He praised Sarah's courage and professionalism during the ambush, noting how she had continued performing her communications duties even while under intense fire. His report would later become part of the evidence supporting Sarah's recommendation for a Purple Heart and Bronze Star for valor. On her third day in the field hospital, doctors made the decision to transfer Sarah to Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany, where she could receive more sophisticated care. The flight itself was another ordeal, as her condition remained extremely fragile, and any complications during transport could prove fatal. Medical personnel accompanied her throughout the journey, monitoring her vital signs and adjusting her care as needed. The arrival at Landstuhl marked the beginning of a new phase in Sarah's fight for survival. The medical center was equipped with state-of-the-art facilities and staffed by specialists who had extensive experience treating the most severe combat injuries. Dr. Michael Chen, the orthopedic surgeon assigned to Sarah's case, immediately recognized that her road to recovery would require not just medical intervention, but also tremendous personal determination. Sarah's parents arrived at Landstuhl just as she was being prepared for another surgery to address complications from her initial treatment. Seeing their daughter connected to machines and fighting for her life was devastating. But they were also amazed by her resilience. Despite everything she had endured, there was still a spark of determination in her eyes that gave them hope. The weeks that followed became a blur of surgeries, setbacks, small victories, and moments of doubt. Sarah underwent 7 additional operations to repair damage that hadn't been addressed during her initial treatment, remove infected tissue, and reconstruct damaged organs. Each procedure carried significant risks, but her medical team was committed to giving her every possible chance at recovery. During her more lucid moments, Sarah began to communicate with her family and medical team through gestures and eventually whispered words. She asked repeatedly about her fellow Marines, wanting to know who had survived the ambush and how they were recovering. Learning that most of her squad had made it through the attack seemed to provide her with additional motivation to continue fighting for her own survival. Physical therapy began while Sarah was still bedridden, with specialists working to prevent muscle atrophy and maintain joint function. The process was incredibly painful, but Sarah approached each session with the same determination that had carried her through Marine Corps training. Her therapists were impressed by her willingness to push through pain and exhaustion in pursuit of small improvements in mobility and strength. The psychological challenges of recovery proved to be just as difficult as the physical ones. Sarah experienced nightmares about the ambush, moments of panic when she heard sudden noises, and periods of deep depression as she contemplated how dramatically her life had changed. Military psychologists worked with her to develop coping strategies and process the trauma she had experienced. As weeks turned into months, Sarah's condition gradually stabilized. Her vital organs began functioning more normally. Her wounds slowly healed, and she regained enough strength to sit up in bed and eventually stand with assistance. The doctors who had initially doubted her chances of survival began talking cautiously about the possibility of her eventually returning to a relatively normal life. But even as Sarah's condition improved, military operations in Iraq continued to evolve. The insurgency in Fallujah remained active, and coalition forces were planning a major offensive to retake control of the city from insurgent fighters. Intelligence reports suggested that the group responsible for the ambush that had nearly killed Sarah was still operating in the area and planning additional attacks. Unknown to Sarah and her family, a special operations task force had been specifically tasked with tracking down the insurgent cell responsible for the attack on her convoy. The unit included Navy SEALs, Army Special Forces, and Marine reconnaissance teams who had been following leads and gathering intelligence for weeks. Their investigation had led them to believe that the insurgent leader who planned the ambush was hiding in a fortified compound in eastern Fallujah. The mission to capture or kill this high-value target was scheduled to coincide with the larger offensive against insurgent forces in the city. For the special operations teams involved, it represented not just a tactical objective but also a chance to deliver justice for Sarah and the other Marines who had been wounded or killed in the attack. As Sarah continued her recovery in Germany, completely unaware of the operations being planned in her honor, she focused on the daily challenges of rehabilitation and the hope of eventually returning to Texas. She had no way of knowing that her story was far from over, and that the same determination that had kept her alive through 11 bullet wounds would soon inspire others to take extraordinary risks in pursuit of justice and closure. 6 months after Sarah Martinez had been evacuated from the blood-soaked streets of Fallujah, Navy SEAL Team 6 operators were conducting final preparations for Operation Iron Justice, a targeted mission to eliminate the insurgent cell responsible for the ambush that had nearly claimed her life. The intelligence picture had finally become clear enough to justify a high-risk, direct-action mission against Abu Rashid al-Zahrawi, the insurgent commander who had planned and executed the attack on Sarah's convoy. Petty Officer First Class Marcus Thompson led the 8-man SEAL element tasked with the mission. Thompson, a veteran of multiple deployments to Afghanistan and Iraq, had read Sarah's after-action report and been moved by her courage under fire. When his team was briefed on the connection between their target and the Marine, who had survived 11 gunshot wounds, the mission took on personal significance that went beyond standard military objectives. The intelligence gathered over months of surveillance indicated that al-Zahrawi was operating from a fortified compound in the Jolan district of Fallujah, an area that had become synonymous with insurgent resistance. The compound was surrounded by high walls, protected by armed guards, and equipped with early warning systems that would make a conventional assault extremely difficult. The SEAL team would need to rely on surprise, speed, and precision to accomplish their mission. Meanwhile, at Brooke Army Medical Center in San Antonio, Texas, Sarah was taking her first tentative steps, without assistance, since the attack. Her recovery had been remarkable by any medical standard. Though she still faced months of additional rehabilitation, and would carry permanent reminders of her injuries for the rest of her life. 3 of the 11 bullets remained in her body, deemed too dangerous to remove due to their proximity to vital organs and major blood vessels. Sarah had been following news coverage of the ongoing operations in Fallujah with intense interest. She knew that coalition forces were conducting a major offensive to retake control of the city, but she had no knowledge of the specific mission being planned in connection to her own experience. Her focus remained on the daily challenges of recovery and the hope of eventually returning to active duty, though doctors had made it clear that her combat days were over. The SEAL insertion into Fallujah took place during the early morning hours of a moonless night in November. Thompson's team infiltrated the city using small boats along the Euphrates River, then moved overland through areas that had been cleared by Marine units earlier in the week. Their route to the target compound required them to traverse nearly 2 miles of hostile territory while avoiding insurgent patrols and improvised explosive devices. Intelligence reports had indicated that al-Zahrawi was meeting with other insurgent leaders to plan coordinated attacks against coalition forces throughout the region. The timing of the SEAL mission was critical. They needed to strike while the high-value targets were gathered in one location. But before the insurgents could disperse and disappear into the urban landscape, as the SEAL team approached their objective, they encountered unexpected complications. Recent fighting in the area had altered the terrain significantly, with collapsed buildings and newly created rubble fields forcing them to modify their planned approach route. Additionally, insurgent activity in the vicinity was higher than anticipated, requiring the team to remain hidden for nearly an hour while an enemy patrol passed through their planned infiltration corridor. The compound itself proved to be even more heavily fortified than intelligence reports had suggested. High walls topped with razor wire surrounded the main building, while armed sentries patrolled the perimeter at regular intervals. Night vision equipment revealed at least 6 guards visible from the team's observation position, with the possibility of additional security inside the compound. Thompson made the decision to divide his team into 2 elements for the assault. 4 SEALs would create a diversion at the front entrance, while the remaining 4 infiltrated through a breach they would create in the rear wall. The plan required precise timing and coordination, as any delay could allow the insurgents to escape or call for reinforcements from nearby cells. The assault began at precisely 0347 hours, with the detonation of explosive charges that breached the compound's rear wall. The diversionary team simultaneously engaged the front guards, creating confusion about the direction of the main attack. Thompson's element moved quickly through the breach, using night vision equipment and suppressed weapons to neutralize guards before they could raise an alarm. Inside the main building, the SEALs encountered fierce resistance from insurgents who had been alerted by the sound of the initial explosions. A running gunfight developed through the narrow corridors and rooms of the structure, with both sides using the building's layout to their advantage. The insurgents' knowledge of the terrain was offset by the SEALs' superior training and equipment. During the firefight, Thompson's team discovered that al-Zahrawi was not in the compound as intelligence had indicated. However, they found extensive documentation detailing planned attacks against coalition forces, as well as evidence linking the insurgent cell to multiple previous attacks, including the ambush that had wounded Sarah. Most importantly, they captured 2 high-ranking insurgent commanders who possessed detailed knowledge of al-Zahrawi's whereabouts and operational plans. The captured documents revealed that al-Zahrawi had relocated to a safe house approximately 3 blocks away, anticipating that coalition forces might eventually target his main compound. Armed with this new intelligence, and facing the possibility that their target might escape if they delayed, Thompson made the difficult decision to immediately pursue al-Zahrawi to his secondary location. The movement to the safe house required the SEAL team to traverse open streets while carrying 2 prisoners and whatever documents they could gather from the original compound. Insurgent forces in the area had been alerted by the sounds of fighting and were beginning to converge on the general vicinity, making the mission increasingly dangerous with each passing minute. At the safe house, al-Zahrawi and 3 bodyguards had barricaded themselves in an upper-floor apartment, using the building's civilian residents as human shields. The structure was a typical Iraqi residential building, with multiple families living in separate units and limited access points that could be easily defended by a small number of determined fighters. Thompson's team faced a tactical nightmare, Their target was protected by innocent civilians in a building that offered multiple escape routes while providing excellent defensive positions for the insurgents. Any assault would need to be conducted with extreme precision to avoid civilian casualties, while preventing al-Zahrawi from escaping through the building's complex layout. The SEALs spent nearly an hour conducting surveillance of the building and developing their assault plan. They identified the specific apartment where al-Zahrawi was located, determined which areas contained civilian families, and located potential escape routes that would need to be covered during the operation. The complexity of the situation required them to call for additional support from Marine units operating in the area. When the final assault began, it demonstrated the highest levels of military precision and tactical skill. Thompson's team used explosive charges to create multiple entry points simultaneously, overwhelming the insurgents' ability to defend all approaches. Specialized breaching techniques allowed them to isolate al-Zahrawi's apartment while ensuring that civilian areas remained secure. The insurgent leader was killed during a brief but intense firefight in the apartment's main room. His bodyguards attempted to fight to the death but were quickly overwhelmed by the SEALs' superior training and equipment. The entire engagement lasted less than 4 minutes from the first explosive breach to the final confirmation that all targets had been neutralized. In the aftermath of the successful mission, Thompson's team recovered additional intelligence materials that would prove valuable for future operations against insurgent networks throughout the region. More importantly for Sarah's story, they found personal effects and documents that definitively linked al-Zahrawi to the planning and execution of the ambush that had nearly claimed her life. When news of al-Zahrawi's death reached Sarah at the medical center in Texas, she experienced a complex mix of emotions. Relief that the man responsible for attacking her convoy would never harm other American service members was tempered by the knowledge that her own recovery remained incomplete and that the broader conflict in Iraq continued to claim lives. On both sides, the successful SEAL mission represented a form of closure for Sarah and her fellow Marines who had survived the Fallujah ambush. It demonstrated that acts of violence against American forces would not go unpunished, and that the military would pursue those responsible regardless of the time and resources required. For the special operations community, it illustrated the importance of precision targeting and the value of persistent intelligence gathering. Sarah's story became something of a legend within military medical circles, inspiring doctors, nurses, and therapists who worked with other severely wounded service members. Her remarkable survival and determined recovery provided hope for others facing seemingly impossible odds. The combination of her personal courage and the dedication of the SEALs who pursued justice on her behalf illustrated the bonds that unite all members of the American military family. Years later, Sarah would complete her recovery sufficiently to return to limited military duties, though she would never again serve in a combat role. She became an advocate for improved medical care for wounded warriors and worked to support families dealing with combat injuries. Her experience in Fallujah and the knowledge that others had risked their lives to hold her attackers accountable shaped her understanding of service, sacrifice, and the enduring connections that bind those who have shared the crucible of combat. The 11 bullets that struck Sarah Martinez on a dusty street in Fallujah had been intended to end her life and demoralize her fellow Marines. Instead, they became symbols of resilience, determination, and the unbreakable bonds between service members who refused to abandon their own. Her survival and the successful mission to eliminate those responsible for her injuries demonstrated that some stories of violence and trauma can ultimately become testimonies to the power of human courage and the pursuit of justice.